Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Linda Liukas. Linda is the author of a series of books for children about computers called Hello Ruby, as well as a new book in Finnish for adults about computing. And she also recently designed a playground in Helsinki designed to teach children about ideas related to computer science. Linda and I had a chance to discuss her path to becoming a children's book author, how to cultivate curiosity, as well as the appeal of generative AI, educational philosophies, how to think about playground design, and even how to think about play versus curiosity. We also spoke about teaching history in computer science, and even the historical intersection of computing and education and the need for rekindling these connections. This was a fantastic conversation, and I had so much fun chatting with Linda. Let's jump in. Linda, so good to be chatting with you. And welcome to the Orthogonal Bet.
Amazing to be here.
Yeah, this is exciting. You're interested in many, many things. I think maybe the best place to start is maybe just around the intersection of computer science and children's books. I guess maybe like what drew you to writing books for children about computers? I mean, is there something about like the child's mindset for and computational thinking? Is there some weird connection there? Was it something personal? What kind of got your start there?
Well, I learned to program properly when I was in my 20s. And the first programming language I fell in love with was Ruby. And I read a comic book. It was called Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby. And it had foxes and rainbows and bacon and all these wonderful stories about programming. And then I got like O'Reilly's standard Ruby books, which are great, but they were kind of like boring after that. And I would read these books, and every time I didn't understand something like what is object-oriented programming or what is memory management, I would do this little doodle character, this Ruby girl. And because I'm from Finland, she became this red-haired little Moo meets Pippi Longstocking kind of as a character. And she was there to explain to me like these concepts. And I kept doing these doodles and drawings. And at the time there was Tumblr, and I started posting these things on Tumblr, and people would say, oh, this is cute. And what if there was like a fox, like the Firefox? And what if there was like snow leopard, like Apple, or like the androids? And for a long time, it was just that. It was me drawing pictures to explain to myself. I think the children's part became afterwards, and this was 10 years ago, roughly. I decided to do a Kickstarter for the project. Again, thinking that it was going to be like mainly for like programmer parents, like a tongue-in-cheek kind of a book about like Ruby and learning these like basic ideas of computation. And at the same time, the world had kind of caught this zeitgeist of learn to code, and everyone was from like President Obama to like your kindergarten teacher. Everyone was excited about learning to code. And the book kind of blew up, and all of a sudden overnight I became a children's book author who like thinks about computers and computing for children. And that became my career. I've been doing it for 10 years, just thinking about how children ought to understand the world of computers, like through narratives, through like hands-on activities, through exploration and just figuring out different mediums of doing that. And picture books are one way of doing that, but I've done a lot of different things also.
Yeah, and so what was the learning process there in terms of trying? Because it sounds like you were first just making things for yourself and making these fun little pictures, and then once people actually realized, oh, you should make a book, and then you got enough attention, like, oh, I need to figure out how to make a children's book. What was the learning process of figuring out the kinds of ways that kids learn? Did it feel different than the way you learned programming? Was it one of these things where maybe it's actually quite universal in the way we can actually teach these kinds of things? Yeah. What was the process of like figuring out how kids learn?
Well, it was panic, first of all, because Kickstarter at the time was quite ruthless, and I was very naive in the sense that I had no idea how long it would actually like take to produce as a physical book, and it ended up being like the project over a year delayed, and like it grew in size and so forth. But I did run a lot of workshops with kids just to kind of like observe them and hear what kind of questions they have and what is interesting for them in the world of computers and computing. And it was also interesting time because at the time computers were still like, obviously they had shrunk in size from like the gigantic computers that like filled entire rooms to the computers that sit on tables to the computers that we can put in our backpacks and our like jean pockets. But still computers were not completely hidden. So I would run workshops where I would ask children to, for instance, imagine and physically sometimes even put like a little on-off button sticker on any everyday object like a microwave or your book or your home keys, and ask them to imagine what this thing would do if it was a computer. And it was still like 10 years ago, a time when you could use your imagination. And nowadays, like everything has turned around us into a computer. And that used to be kind of the big thing I would say to the kids. Everything will turn around you into a computer, and you will need to use your imagination and your will and vision of the world to make this future into what you want it to be. So it was a lot of that kind of exploration. I think one of the beauties is that I was read a lot of children's literature when I was growing up. So I had like a healthy regime of Narnias and Roald Dahls and like this whole like deep to look into. And I think it's quite interesting to return as a grown up and observe what is kind of the first way you learn about the world and those stories and what they tell about the world. And I, for once, was fed with a lot of Nordic storytelling, which is quite a different type of storytelling from kind of the Anglo-Saxon. It's a lot of like family-based stories. My favorite is Tove Jansson's Moomin series, where it's like a misfit family, self-chosen family, and every single adventure ends with pancakes. So not the lone hero story that a lot of kids learn from storybooks in other countries. Anyways, that kind of work went into it. And I feel like every single book taught me something. So the first book was about learning to code, but pretty soon I got interested in the like larger field of computer science. So it became a book about computer hardware, a book about how the internet works, and eventually also a book about machine learning and AI. So how computers are learning about the world and learning to learn. So I feel like every single project I've done, I've always been 2 or 3 steps like away with the skills that I ought to have. So yeah.
That's amazing. Did you ever run any of the workshops, the things you mentioned with like running them with kids, like imagining these things? Did you run any of them with adults as well, and to see how they differed, or maybe it was something universal there?
I think one of the nice things about kids is I've never done parallel, because I think grown-ups, sometimes it's easier for them to like approach subjects in a childlike manner. And I know a lot of like C-level like directors who like secretly read the Ruby books to learn what an algorithm is. But I think that the beauty of working with children is that they are not like midi adults. They're, I think, better experimentalists. They take more risks. They are kind of like the original king philosophers in that they ask a lot of questions like why and what if and just like question a lot of the work. And then the best workshops are ones where their direction just completely changes based on the kids. So one of my favorite activities from a few years ago was when I was in Winchester in Virginia, and I had this activity that is all about like drawing what the internet looks like. And sometimes kids, like, they draw apps, they draw like servers, they draw like code, all kinds of things. But we were in a library, and the library happened to have a very soft carpet, and the kids had very pointy like pencils, and they were drawing their internets as they do. And one little boy like accidentally punched through the paper with his pen. And he came to me and said, like, it's completely like ruined. I need to have a new paper. And I said, like, yeah, but wait a minute. Like, what if we lift this paper up and we kind of flicker it? You see how the light kind of pulses through? And did you know that actually the internet is like this? It's fiber optic cables where light pulses on the bottom of the sea. And you can think of the internet like this. And this is actually a really cool metaphor or a way of thinking about internet. So he started punching his paper. And then I noticed a little girl next to him be like, what is he doing? And like started punching the paper also. And then the idea started spreading in the room, on the floor, in the library where all the kids were working. And then we got to talk about virality and kind of how networks, and especially in social networks, ideas can travel quite quickly. And none of that was prescribed. None of that was like hid in a curriculum. None of that was in a lesson plan. It was more like me observing the kids, the materials, the tools. And I think that's one of the beauties of working with kids is like, you never know what's going to happen. They surprise you. Whereas grown-ups are more narrow-minded and they want so what am I going to be like able to learn in this? Like, what are the 5 things and the 3 takeaways from this lesson?
Do you think there's a way of actually encouraging adults to kind of have that more like that mindset? Is it the kind of thing where some adults have it, some don't, and that's just kind of how it is? Or is there a way of like, I don't know, creating the environment for that kind of thing? Because I like that very undirected sort of
Yeah.
exploration.
The great children's book author Lewis Carroll had a character called Alice in Wonderland. And in Alice in Wonderland, there's the queen who says, I can think of 6 impossible things before breakfast. And she encourages Alice to do the same. So I think it's a skill, like the ability to be curious about the world. And some of us have it. Like I know reporter friends who are just endlessly curious. But I think the generative AI actually gives us a permission to like practice our curiosity and realize that it's a muscle that we can develop and keep going and kind of rediscover.
Well, that's interesting. And
Ask
so,
a lot of questions.
yeah, I was going to say, yeah, so related to that in terms of like this cultivating curiosity, do you think then, because I can see some people saying, oh, like generative AI kind of stultifies. On the other hand, though, it is this thing, right, that is very willing to indulge any question. Like it never gets bored. It never says, like you've asked enough questions, like stop saying why or whatever it is. So for you, like these LLMs and these generative AI tools, they're actually really good at cultivating curiosity.
Well, I think the pedagogy is needed, and again, like it's not about the just the tool itself, like or the activity, like the internet drawing activity could have turned out completely boring and predictable. We could have seen like 50,000 Netflix and YouTube icons and that's it. So I think the educator or the pedagogic like lead is always needed. And the same with ChatGPT. It's like if we teach kids to ask 600 questions, like probably they will be really good at using generative AI if we just let them use the bland, median, like boring center answer it spews out automatically, like probably not.
So how is that different though? I want to keep on, I'm thinking more about this curiosity thing. How does that feel different than just getting people to just like look things up, like whether in books or on Google or whatever it is? Like what do you feel is different about the AI aspect here?
It feels like a muscle, at least to me. It feels like the more you develop the skill to ask questions that you don't feel intimidated by how other people look at you, the better you will get with the generative AI. And a lot of us are taught the opposite muscle, which is like to just be quiet, at least in Scandinavian countries, to seem smart and to just like abstain from any sort of intellectual like curiosity from an early age. I think that's the difference. And then whereas like search results, like you search once maybe, and if you're lucky you search twice, but people like the Google front page kind of like, I remember a time when I could go through all the pages on Google and on the page like 17 I would find like that nugget of information, but that was taken away from us because of the ad business basically.
Yeah, well, I also view it as like thinking about like I look something up on Wikipedia and then suddenly that leads me to like 3 other articles, and each of those articles leads me to more and more, and suddenly I've just realized I have like I don't know 30 tabs open, and I'm just like exploring many, and that's really really exciting. Is that the exception?
My little brother is the same, and I think it's a different brain. So I've never had that experience happen to me, but I hear people describing it. But I have had those like rally conversations with ChatGPT where I just go deeper and deeper and weirder and weirder. It's nice that there are pathways for all kinds of humans, and maybe that should be like a school discipline, like just curiosity, and you
Oh, I love this. Right.
in
and so,
whichever way you
right. And so like some people, the Wikipedia route works better. Some people it's like the generative AI. Some people, maybe just straight up Google or whatever it is. But it's also right. It's about
maybe
finding,
some people just sit and think.
Right. They just send or they're looking things up in dictionary, like actual physical dictionaries, like whatever it is. Right. They're niche. It's almost different people have different ways of unlocking their curiosity, and we need to find those kinds of things. Because maybe it is that everyone already has kind of that latent curiosity. We just need to find the right way to.
And that is kind of my biggest pet peeve or sort of fear with generative AI, is that it doesn't always encourage that curiosity. It encourages that bland, like general, predictable first answer. And if you're not someone who is used to using these tools, it is very easy to be like, oh, wow, this is the state of the art. Let's go with this. I took part in this like a library workshop where children were generating stories and pictures based on AI, and was really pumped and excited. And then I saw the results, and they were like really bad. They were just like Harry Potter fan fiction, werewolves, so forth. So it was clear that like the instructor wasn't like they didn't see generative AI as a material where the grown up pushes and leads a little bit. They just let the kids do the first thing that came to their mind, which is a great starting point, but I don't think that's enough.
Yeah. So what is, and when you're facilitating this kind of thing? Like, what are the kinds of
Mhm.
ways in which you encourage that, like, divergent kind of curiosity as opposed to just like converging on
So,
the
so
these
I
common, yeah.
like it's a weird thing. I keep coming back a lot to Italy, and in Italy there's this philosophy. We all know Montessori schools, and they've had like a big way for the past 20 or so years. And I think at some point like there was this talk about like half of Silicon Valley being a Montessori educated folk. But there's another pedagogical philosophy called Reggio Emilia, and Reggio Emilia, it's this tiny sort of municipality a few hours from Milan, and basically they realized after the Second World War they had lost a whole generation of kids, and they decided to create a completely new kind of art-based pedagogy. The idea was that the child has 100 languages of expressing themselves. So we don't think about the beige sort of Montessori like wooden tools, rather that the child has 100 languages of expressing themselves. They even wrote a poem, and the poem says that the child has the language of writing and reading, which is typical in schools, but then also the language of crawling, of chalk, of paint, of computation maybe even. And I think the beautiful thing they do to keep this open-ended explorative idea is that they invest so much in the educators and teachers. So there's always two in a classroom, and their job is not to sort of prescribe like these are the lesson plans, these are the goals. Their role is to like introduce kids to different kinds of materials like light or like certain kind of like rough paper, and then allow the children and their own curiosity to lead the way and be there to document, to share with the other educators, and to kind of stay out of the way, but are there as grown-ups and present and leading. And I think honestly we have so much to learn from it's not like a nicely commercialized and packaged like philosophy that is easy to license and buy, but I feel like Reggio for me is the answer for a lot of these challenges around like education and creating that space for children to sort of lead with their curiosity. And yeah, I would look at Italy and the 1960s. It's still ongoing though, but that's where it started from.
Yeah, and does that philosophy seem like particularly well suited for like this current moment with AI, where it's like
Yep.
it's a moment, or it's a philosophy that allows you, right, to like diverge in how you think about these kinds of things versus saying,
Yep.
you know, you're all kind of just going to use it.
I often think, what would Vea Vecchi think of this? What would Loris Malaguzzi think of this? And like go back to the grandmasters of that philosophy and way of seeing that and help understand the modern paradigms.
That's amazing. I guess going back to children's books, I mean, you mentioned Alice in Wonderland and like believing like the impossible, like a certain number of impossible things before breakfast. Are there other, I mean, there are many different types of children's books. Are there ones that you find particularly useful for cultivating that kind, or either cultivating that curiosity or maybe just demonstrating the kinds of thinking that you want?
I think expansive books that contain entire worlds. And this is, of course, like a subjective experience. But as a kid, I truly loved books that allowed you to kind of think that in the world there could be like another world. And those would include things like, of course, Narnia and Harry Potter's and Catherine Rundell comes to mind as a sort of, I completely fell in love with her work recently. She also wrote a book about John Donne, the poet. And what I love about her is that her children's books take the world seriously, and she takes children very seriously. Maybe that's my answer, like books that take children seriously and they try not to be too cheesy and too like preachy in their tone. Those are the ones that equip children with thinking skills that will help them going forward.
Oh, I love that. And then also in terms of like saying like there are these rich worlds that are worth exploring just in your own mind, in addition to in the story. One of my preoccupations is like thinking about world building. How do you think about, I mean, because there are different approaches to world building. There's like the very structured, it's kind of like, then there's like a more seat of the pants approach. There's something that kind of maybe evolves over time as people develop the books more. Do you have like, do you have like strong opinions on the right way to do world building?
When I grew up in Finland in the 90s and early 2000s, and IRC was a big thing. And what I ended up doing a lot on IRC, which was this like chat-based, text-based server where you would meet other people. We would like role play. It was called live role playing, but instead of like really live role playing, we would do it online. And I would have these like epic Star Wars-based universes. And I still today know the people I would have these like games with, but we created like entire universes, like economic systems, like personal drama for sure. And then I got to be like, my character was Saber Sunrider, the fearless Jedi Knight. And I feel like there we had the Star Wars lore and we had those basic building blocks, and then we went just wild after that. So I think a good story building allows for that. It like offers enough kind of history and enough characters, enough of a universe, and then allows like the kind of fan base to go wild after that. And I haven't heard of like children who have created universes based on Ruby yet, but the first readers are only in their teenage years now. So, being a children's author is kind of interesting because you have this like 25-year-old year like span where you kind of get to see the set the seeds at like age 5 and then see them grow up. But I did approach Ruby with the idea that the 4 books form like a little universe, and there are like same characters, same toys, same objects that appear across the universe, and it's in that sense like a whole world.
Related to these early readers actually growing up, like have you like, is there like a community for these people as they're kind of growing, like, and I guess, how have you seen the readers early on kind of grow up, or how has it affected their, I mean, it's one of those, you can't really run like a control, like there's not like a control, but like how have you felt that it has kind of affected maybe how they, like whether or not they have software developer jobs, like maybe they do, but it's also just like, I imagine it probably affects a little bit of how they think about the world and maybe changes their sense of delight in computing.
So. That would be like a huge win. I think it's interesting. I've worked on all kinds of like projects around computation and computing and learning computation, and like in nonprofit projects, it's always like, what are the impact metrics? Like, what are the job results? Then in commercial projects, it's like, what are your growth numbers? What is the like cost of acquisition? And then in children's books, like nada. Like we measure time in such a glacial like way. I have lots of anecdotes from sweet parents and educators, and they still send me pictures, and it makes me really smile. But I think the first moment when I'll see like a parent who was read, like a grown-up who read Ruby as a small kid and now decides to return with that book to their own kid, like that, maybe that's my pinnacle. That's the like sweet success moment that like allows me to say that, okay, this thing has legs. And obviously, like hopefully there's going to be someone who's going to see the world differently or see the world of technology differently. And that was a lot of the thinking, that like after reading the Ruby books, the kids won't probably be able to like hit the curriculum standards. They won't like necessarily know what a CPU is or what it does, but they will, when they run into these terms and concepts, they will have this like faint memory from childhood that, like I think it was the bossy one inside the computer that Ruby met, and like lack of fear. Maybe that's what children's books can also offer, like for kids.
Love that. I also just love that idea of like, on the one hand, right, it's sometimes valuable to have metrics and kind of show that you can actually measure the impact of certain things. On the other hand, though, especially when you're thinking about very long-term impacts or things that are much more diffuse, like those, like proposing metrics and trying to be ruled by them, it's not good. And are there other areas that you've either played with or you've seen other than children's books that also feel a little bit more willing to kind of indulge like this long-term and kind of like fuzzier impact?
Yeah. So playgrounds, that's like a space I've been working with for a few years now. A lot of like the ideas behind having an open-ended space and like allowing for sort of this free-form curiosity were born also out of the fact that I spent a lot of time on playgrounds during COVID times, and all of a sudden I was like looking around and being like, oh gosh, that like this is where the school like innovation is happening, or educational innovation. Like we are doing at playgrounds all of the hard stuff that schools, for whatever reason, like funding or structure, can't do. So kids are like doing project-based learning. They are conflict resolving. They are like, grown-ups are there not as the educators or teachers like preaching what they should be doing, but we are there as like the support and helping out if needed. And then I started to really like pay attention to the kinds of play structures or play affordances maybe that playgrounds offered, and they were great, but they were kind of like a lot of castles and pirate ships and so forth. And I figured that what if there was a way of teaching computer science and these big ideas around computers through like crawling and jumping and dancing. And one of the big things that I immediately learned about playgrounds is that whatever else they are stubborn. Like playgrounds, at least in Finland, which is a country that gets like very cold winters, they are built for 20 years. So I think it's interesting to think that whatever code I write is like mostly going to be forgotten, like, and especially like all of the generative like AI code I create is just like almost one-off use code. And then the picture books have a little bit of a more like a longer life cycle, and hopefully they will like live for many generations, but who knows? But then the playground is stubbornly going to be there as like, it might be that in 20 years time, I'll think that, gosh, computers, but it's still going to be there. So it became kind of this practice in like, what are some ideas that are relevant in 20 years time when the next time that the city is going to like work on this playground, what will they look like?
I love that. And as well, and the playground, and going back to what you were saying in terms of like the world building, like building a world that has like it's almost like a playground or a sandbox of like, here's the pieces and you kind of play with it. And like now you're doing that in a very physical and real way. And so I guess I have a number of questions about playgrounds, but I guess maybe first of all, like how do you balance when it comes to a playground, the kind of the aspect of like trying to educate children about certain ideas, but also just kind of give them the building blocks to have that great degree of open-endedness. I assume there's a lot of research on playgrounds and how to build them. And what is the thinking there?
There is a lot of different tradition. And again, there's a lot of history of playgrounds, which is really fascinating. So playgrounds were to some extent born in with like Friedrich Fröbel and his ideas of like kindergarten. So how like the kids
and his gifts, like the different blocks.
Yeah, exactly. And then those ideas spread to the States with the world fairs, and for a long time like a playground was just like a big pile of sand that was dumped into a city center to keep the kids from like running on the streets, which was like lethal at the time because there was very few places for kids. And that is kind of the early genesis of playgrounds. But then through the history of playgrounds, there's been so many different kinds of eras. So there's this idea of like risky, like adventure playgrounds. And in today's era, I think a lot of like playgrounds from the 1960s or 70s look like terrifying because they have none of those safety standards. And then some of like the 90s playgrounds, at least to my eyes, look too cushioned and too plasticky and too kind of boring that you have only one way of playing. And I think every era is kind of balancing this idea of like, how do we allow kids to express themselves and be there and experiment things. And I live nowadays in Paris, where it's really interesting to see that like France have a very different idea about what is the role of the children in society, where like in Nordic countries, we have amazing playgrounds, just like the stuff of dreams, but children are kind of like in their own little space, and you have IKEA and you have like small child-sized things, and children are kind of seen as valuable members, but smaller sized members of the society. And then the French way of seeing is that like there are playgrounds, but they are not like guarded or railed away from the rest of society or rest of the park. Rather, the idea is that children should be a part of the public discussion as they are. And like, there's no children's menus in restaurants. Rather, children should eat the same thing as grown-ups and be there. And no one frowns upon like seeing kids in public spaces. Whereas I think in Nordic countries, we kind of tend to think that, oh, the kids should be in the play pit or so forth. So it is this kind of like dance between different ideas of what it means to be a kid, what it means to take risk, and what it means to play in different eras. And when you mentioned the word sandbox or sandbox mode, it was super fascinating. And I wish there was more research on this, but I haven't really found it. We asked almost 400 kids in the neighborhood to like draw and write like the best thing they've done in a public park and the best thing they've done on a computer or a phone. And then the scariest thing that has ever happened to them in a public playground, and the scariest thing that has happened to them online. And then the thing that they've done that they are most proud on a playground and again, like online. And I think we were looking kind of for sort of texture and color to kind of present to the city officials and so forth. But it was really interesting to see what a generation there is growing up now, like a generation of kids for who like their Fortnite lobby is a public space, like more than the playground, or a generation of kids who thinks that sandbox mode means Minecraft, not like the physical sandbox, and a generation of kids who might think that things they create on Minecraft are equally, or Roblox are equally like important as the things that they develop in parks and playgrounds. And at the same time, we would get these very, really like beautiful answers also on the role of public parks and play, and also how a lot of the scary stuff that used to happen, at least in my childhood, we were warned about, like people who might come and kidnap us or whatever in playgrounds. Like a lot of the scary stuff actually nowadays happens online for the kids. They get videos or they get like scary chain mails or so forth. So it's kind of like a generation in flux. And I think it's really interesting, a challenge for everyone, not only the one person making computer science themed playgrounds, but every single playground and public space designer to think about what it means to design for this generation of kids whose experiences online are really shaping their early childhood.
Yeah. So what do you think are the takeaways in terms of like how to create a good playground right in this kind of weird moment of change and flux?
Yeah. Well, the first thing was the 20-year time span. I said, like, do you realize that these kids grow up in a world where like every 3 months the Fortnite island like has an earthquake or something new appears, that like we need to introduce software updates to these playgrounds that we need to already plan for, like every 2-3 years introduce something new to keep it engaging. And obviously childhoods are shorter than 20 years. That's like the span of a generation. But I think it would be a good and interesting design challenge for any playground to think about, like, how can we introduce the idea of updates? Because that's something software engineering did so beautifully, like all of the agile and like all of those methodologies versus kind of the waterfall model of city planning. And then I was told that, oh, that's like really difficult, that you have a maintenance budget, but you can't have like a building budget. So maybe it's for the next city council to create a tool for software updates for playgrounds. That was one of the big takeaways. One idea is also, I think, the division between software and hardware. So playgrounds obviously are amazing as places where you can take risks and climb. And one of the sort of big attractions of this park is a 6-meter high input-output machine, very sort of von Neumannian, where the kids can be like viruses or data or their favorite game characters or whatever they wish to be. And they crawl inside of the computer, and there's a bus that connects the CPU to the RAM, and then they can slide out and all of that stuff. But after doing this project, I think the more important part was the software of the playground, which is the playground workers, the parents, the grandparents. Whenever you have a playground, you always have like grown-ups present there. And if we can somehow make it more useful for the grown-ups to be there, give them also tools to play with their kids, it becomes a better public space for everyone. So we ended up doing these like QR codes where you would have like a little prompt. For instance, there's this rotating mobile phone where you can like dance your favorite victory dance or whatnot. But then behind the QR code, there's more information about the kinds of algorithms, for instance, that decide what kind of ads you see on your phone or so forth. We did worksheets for local educators and like an audio guide you can listen to and learn about computers and their role in society and city planning. All of this stuff, these layers of like human and community involvement that parks present, and there's multiple like examples of this happening in parks everywhere around the country or the world. That was kind of the biggest takeaway for me, that the hardware matters. It's important to invest in amazing playgrounds, but then the software, the role that like playgrounds play in building communities and parks in general, especially in a time when our sort of online communities are kind of divided. This is a gentrifying neighborhood where now children from all over Helsinki come to visit. Like anyone can come. You can meet like someone who doesn't necessarily think the same way you do or see the same Instagram reels as you do. And that's a luxury in today's age.
So have you seen the extent to which people are actually using the QR codes or things like that? I imagine you can actually track like whether or not they're actually using the software or whether or not just kids are kind of just using the hardware aspects of it.
Yeah, I think there is probably a way of doing it. And at least the playground tracks in a very sort of old-fashioned way. Some of the workers track how many groups visit there on like a yearly basis. I haven't asked for those stats because I think these things take quite a while to work. And again, are you planning for 20 years or are you planning for the next quarter? And I'm lucky to be in a business where it's like, it's more the generational span. So I don't care if there's like 5 or 5,000 like downloads on the QR code. I care that thinking exists and that like the city and the educators and the local communities like get to know about this stuff.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering more in terms of to what degree, because like with the like the actual physical infrastructure of the playground, I imagine there's some kind of guided learning, but it could also be very, very open-ended. The
Yeah.
actual information might give you a little bit more about it. And I'm just wondering kind of the extent, like the balance there in terms of how people
Yeah.
are playing with it. But I imagine it's also,
No.
it could go in waves as well.
It could go in long ways. We have terrible winters and we don't actually shut the playgrounds. That's always the first question I got from like foreign reporters is like, when you get snow, like what happens? Like, no, we put clothes on. We go outdoors still. I think the one interesting thing when you're doing something for the public space was I put so much effort into this project. And then when it was done, like there was immediately sabotage. Like people would rip out the QR codes and
Really?
there was someone who would
God.
pee into the slide, like children's slide. I'm like, oh, that's so disgusting.
Terrible.
And that happens online too. Like you release something and then people like metaphysically pee all over it. In this case, it was like really doing it.
It was literal, yeah.
Yeah, it was literal, but it was still worth doing it. And then I think the cool thing that happened is that the neighboring community really, like the buildings and the sort of citizens started to like pay attention, and they started to call the police, and they would put like stubbornly up the new QR codes all the time, even though they kept being like pulled apart. And now the park is fine. Like there's no sabotage anymore, because you would see that like, no, this neighborhood really likes this park and wants to keep it this way. And maybe there's a lesson learned in that also for our online spaces.
Like as you were developing the playground, and I guess this is also just more broadly, you had to think about what are the ideas within computing and computer science that are going to be relevant like 20 years in the future. What was that process, and what were those basic ideas that you kind of settled on?
Yeah, well, that sounded a little grandiose. I think it was both like a practical challenge as well as a kind of like what we can make happen. But definitely, like I went through like the curriculum guidelines for the city of Helsinki as well as like national level ones. And now that I'm developing a few new playgrounds, I actually start with the curriculums, because in many ways curriculums are supposed to be like expansive enough that and high level enough that they would like work for maybe not, if not 20 years, at least 10 years into the future. So we ended up covering input, output, algorithms, also flowcharts. We did like a hopscotch thing where you kind of jump through a flowchart just for kids to get a sense of like sequences and selection and loops. We did sandbox for the sake that you could practice there, like bigger and smaller and sorting, and just like sand as a material is I think very computational, not only in the sense of silicone, but just in that it's like moldable. We did algorithms through like, we did trampolines where you could like practice kind of like a Simon Says type of games, where Simon says everyone with a red shirt goes jump 3 times, so the kids can practice algorithms in that way. We did a keyboard where you can, like a gigantic, like 3 to 5 meter big keyboard where you can jump around on the keyboard. I suspect that's gonna age badly, or it's gonna be like an ancient computer in a ancient way of inputting information in a few years' time. And one of my favorites is we did this little play hut that has a chalkboard on the back side of it, and on the front side of it there's like a little browser window. And the idea was that kids could like perform their YouTube videos, or like start a web shop, or kind of like do these playground things. Like I remember from childhood starting an ice cream store, but kind of have a little like online twist to it. So, but then they can obviously just like play there as a play hut thing anyways. Those kinds of ideas. And as mentioned, I've been now working on a few other concepts like synthetic biology. I want to make a playground around that, and then one on semiconductors. And then I've had really like weird and deep and like involved discussions around quantum computing playground and mirrors and stuff like that. And obviously like AI computer, like AI playground would be really cool as well. But if I've learned anything is that these are slow projects. They take 5 years, 6 years, require a lot of coordination. So we'll see when the next one is gonna like pop up somewhere in the world.
That's super exciting. Yeah, and you mentioned a lot of different ideas. How are you choosing these ideas, and especially like the synthetic biology?
They choose me. The ideas choose me. It's always like that. Like biology, for instance, like I don't think I even have the energy to start learning about it, but it just seems so like everywhere I look, it's like, yeah, but we are computation, and our like bodies are computation, and the whole life is computation. And then I feel like there's the same bias as I had when I was younger, that like a lot of the existing materials are really dry, and we need someone to shake us in the shoulders and say, but this is really interesting and cool. And for me, I am the one who needs to then like make these things happen. So no, I'm really happy that this gets to be my job, and I get to do this kind of work.
Oh, it's super exciting. And you also, and we were talking earlier about curiosity, and we've also just talked about a lot about play. What is the, like, how do you think about the relationship between those two ideas? Like, is curiosity sort of a subset of play?
I think they are probably of the same continuum, that a lot of the stuff we learn through play comes from our curiosity, and then the play leads to work. And I feel just honestly really happy that I've been able to play a lot of my career. Feels like that, whether it's with like picture books or playgrounds or something else. It feels there's the sort of looseness and the brevity and kind of joy present all the time.
And I wonder if maybe that's also the key in terms of like how to actually cultivate curiosity, is like viewing it much more as a playful thing, like as opposed to like, oh, I have to be curious because I need to learn about these things. Like that's
true.
Like making it feel like work is not gonna work.
No, you can't add it to your checklist of the day. Like,
right, like how many times have I been curious today? Yeah, that doesn't really.
But I think the 6 will help you.
Yes, right. You can right. There's ways of cultivating it, but like making it feel like a job. Yeah. There's something in between. And related to that also, we've talked a lot about like kids and cultivating curiosity and play and like playgrounds for children. One of the things I'm also very interested in is continuous learning and like adult education, and especially within computer science. I've seen like certain kinds of things, like the Recurse Center does like some really interesting ideas around trying to like make people having this like retreat for programmers to kind of get them to kind of constantly like level up and think more. How do you think about that kind of continuous learning process for adults? Because like certainly there's certainly within like software development, I need to learn the newest language or the newest frameworks or whatever to kind of make sure I'm not obsolete. But there's also the aspect of, I want to, like, these things are interesting and fun and I should be playing and kind of constantly learning. Like, how do you think about all these ideas from like the perspective of adults?
I went last summer to the National Gallery, and they had this like exhibition on Hockney and Del Piero. And David Hockney was like writing a lot about how he learned to paint back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And it was a lot of copying and a lot of like studying the classics and looking at them and just like building the muscle skill and so forth. And then I think about like students in literature, how much they need to read other people's texts before they start writing their own text. And I think it shows that computer science is a young discipline. It's like a little bit over 80 years old, and it's kind of like a mishmash from mathematics and engineering and as an intellectual history. And then like the kind of like the boot camps that came up and so forth. I think we're still kind of figuring out what are those like tools and what does it mean to like look back, and what does it mean to build skills, and the idea of copying the masters for Hockney wasn't that like the world needed more copies of Del Piero's work. It was to develop his own taste and his own eye and thinking and maybe an appreciation towards the lineage where he comes from. And I think all of that is somehow like lacking in today's software continuous learning or professional development too. As you said, like very focused on kind of what is the latest tool or the new framework that I should be picking up. So I see a lot of like space for that kind of like more contemplative, more like, what if I study some old algorithms to take those ideas into the modern day? And it always makes me smile whenever someone says, well, the latest in AI. I'm like, yeah, the latest in AI is from the 1970s or 60s or the 80s, like research papers from there. And it's only now that we have the computing power or the data to kind of run those ideas. So imagine if we were a discipline that would look a little bit more eagerly into the history. What could we discover? What could we learn?
No, I love this. And yeah, I certainly wholeheartedly agree with that. I think the world of computer science and like the tech world is like deeply ahistorical. Like it's always like, let's focus on the new, without realizing that the new is actually not that new. It's like built upon this large framework and history and foundations, and learning a little bit of that and like understanding the path dependence of how we got to where we are, seeing these old ideas that are only now maybe being able to be implemented that are actually not so new. That I think would give us a much greater sense of understanding of just
why do you think that happens, that like historicity?
I mean, that's a good question. I think partly there is the focus on the new, of like whatever whatever has come before is not as exciting. We're always wanting to make a new company, a new advance, and so therefore you don't necessarily want to look at what has come before you, because I imagine there's the thinking that that's a waste of time. right? Like it's
Yeah.
like I have to
And those
always
are
be
also the stories we tell about like the new company and the new founder.
Right. Versus realizing that like, yeah, all the ideas and concepts and ways of thinking about computing, they were evident like really in like the origins of computing. Like you look in like the 40s and 50s, like they were talking about everything from certain ideas around AI to like simulating biology in computer. Like these are all ideas that are not novel. But I think there is a sense of like, and I'm kind of just exploring this as we're talking as well, which is like maybe I think for many people, if there is, and when we mentioned before, you were mentioning before how a lot of the code you're going to write has a very short half-life. Like it feels very evanescent. But because people might think that, oh, their code is not going to last that long, they need to make an impact as quickly as possible. And as a result, any time spent thinking historically, maybe that's a waste of time. And sounds like for us, like it's the exact opposite. Like that is not only not a waste of time, like that is the only way in which you can really understand the true sense of what is actually possible in computing. But I don't know. So, do you have a thought on why?
No, I'm just thinking that like, is there something we could learn from the kind of two families of computers, like either the history of mathematics and how they look at like their discipline, or the history of engineering, where the bridge builders exactly the same, that everyone said that, oh, those hotheads, or the railroad makers, that they never think about like where they come from. Or is computer science like honestly something very novel? I don't have answers.
I don't know.
It's really cool that we are starting to have like historians who look at the history of this discipline, because it's like many of the luminaries are still here, or like they are old already, but they are still here, and it's at the final times that we can get some answers and like stories from them.
No, I love this. Yeah, and actually, when I was working on my most recent book, I when I had certain questions about some of these like old stories of computing or certain quotations, I was able to email the luminaries, and it's wonderful. And it's this amazing thing, right? We still have like the founders of these fields, and so
One of the ideas around history I've been really obsessed with lately is early childhood education, which is probably like for me the closest sort of where I academically or so aligned to. And computer science have this kind of shared, like there used to be a time when both the people who worked with young children and the people who worked with young computer minds or early AI used to sort of overlap much more and share ideas with one another.
I was going to say, like Mindstorms was like exactly one of these things.
And Piaget, like his influence, so he had Minsky, he had Papert, and then I just finished Benoit Mandelbrot's, he's fractalist, and apparently he also worked at Piaget's laboratory in Geneva for 2-3 years when he was younger. And then my like brain exploded. I'm like, wow. And I feel as like somehow these two worlds have diverged so much that you rarely see like the Reggio Emilia Atelieristas at like the NeurIPS conference, like discussing with the neural network experts. It's just like a pity, and there was this very fruitful time in the 1960s when these like worlds of math and computer science and early childhood overlapped in a beautiful way. So maybe that's my call to arms, that hopefully like there is some interesting work being done around that all over the world.
I love that. I love this charge of trying to reconnect those two areas, which had very deep connections and a lot of similarities, and like whether it's a tool for thought or how we educate or how we just use computers, and trying to like look to how children learn. Yeah, that charge might be a great place to end. That is fantastic. I love it. So thank you so much. This is an amazing conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.